Welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this tutorial episode, I'm going to show you how to create the lizard face artwork I created. I know the name sounds like some sort of new character from a Marvel movie, but I couldn't think of anything better to call it. Well, let's get burning. Use the shader pen tip of your choice to burn under the edges of the eyelids. Make sure to keep your pen tip in optimal position as you burn. If you're not familiar with my terminology, I put a link to a video that explains them in the description below. The eye is mostly dark, but there is a pale ring around the iris, reflected light in the upper left corner, and a slight hint of eyelids, or what I'm calling eyelids, along the top and the sides of the eye. Burn the eye to a uniform dark brown or black color, but avoid the ring, the reflection, and the hint of visible eyelids. Rotate the board as needed while you work so that the pen tip stays in optimal position. Now darken up the right side of the eye to a medium brown color. Ignore the section on the upper eyelid that I did. I will cover that in a little bit. Create a clearly defined edge on the eyelid and then darken up the lid. The goal is to burn the area to a very dark brown or black color, leaving just a hint of the eyelid visible. The color for the hint of eyelid should be 1 to 2 shades lighter than the rest of the eye. I am using a combination of uniform strokes and circular motion to work on this. Burn pull-away strokes along the inner eyelid above the eye. Start the stroke on the upper edge of the lid and pull it down towards the bottom of the lid, but stop near the halfway mark. Reburn over the strokes if needed, so the area is dark brown to black in color. It should match the color of the majority of the eye. Afterwards, burn over the end of the eyelid using circular motion to darken it up. Now let's work on the upper left area of the eye. Carefully burn around the reflection in the eye. Make sure to keep your pen tip in optimal position when working near any edge. For quick or small areas, I find it's easy to just rotate or angle my hand, but you may prefer to rotate the board. Check with the reference photo frequently when working on the eye. I removed the many pauses in the video where I stopped burning to consult the reference photo. Every time you pause, lift your pen tip up and away from the wood. Never let your pen tip rest on the wood unless you are actively burning. With this last bit of the eye, just burn it to a brown color and we will finish it a little later on. Lightly burn over the ring around the iris. Make sure to burn in the gap in the ring that is found along the bottom of it. Now let's burn in the dark blue area to the right of the eye. Burn a line under the upper scales and then fill in the area to a medium brown color. Leave the reflected light area alone, as we'll burn that in later. With the left upper corner of the eye, leave a hint of the inner eyelid above the reflection. Also, leave a roundish area of reflected light next to the left edge of the large reflection on the eye. Make the roundish area a couple of shades darker in color. Lastly, leave a very slight hint of an eyelid below that roundish area. With the area to the right of the eye, burn in the section to the left of the reflection. Rotate the board if needed to keep your pen tip in optimal position. While the board is rotated, burn in the blue area on the lower eyelid. Check with the reference photo often to avoid the areas of reflected light. Some of those areas are pretty small. Then finish burning in the small area on the other side of the reflection. Afterwards, start on the shadows along the bottom of the eyelid. On the screen, the bottom appears as the top since the board is rotated. Burn a line along the edge of a scale and then burn short pull-away strokes along the edge. Start the stroke on the edge and pull it towards the eye. Overlap your strokes to get smoother burn results. Now, extend the color and soften the edges of the pull-away burn marks by burning over the area using circular motion. Continue to burn in the shadows on the eyelid. On this section, I mostly use circular motion and very little pull-away strokes. If you are more comfortable with the pull-away strokes, then use that burn stroke. Our goal is to create an eyelid that has a rounded appearance. How you achieve that goal is up to you. Now let's work on the next eyelid, or what I'm calling an eyelid. This gets the same treatment as the first one, so burn a line along the edge of the eyelid. Then burn pull-away strokes along the edge. Start the stroke on the edge and pull it towards the eye. Stop the stroke a short distance from where it starts. Afterwards, burn over the ending edge of the pull-away strokes using circular motion to extend the color and soften or blur that edge. With the upper eyelid, burn in the shadows on the more pronounced scales along the ends of the eyelid. Then burn along the inner edge to darken it slightly. This eyelid is not very dark in color, so keep your shadows in the tan range. I am using circular motion for this step. Rotate the board and burn a line along the upper edge of the eyelid. Then burn in the dark areas as marked by the green arrow. If needed, further define the shadow above the seam line between the two scales. Next, burn in the blue skin to the right of the pronounced scales on the eyelid. This area has a lot of small white scales that you need to avoid burning over. I recommend using a small shader or a writer pen tip to work in this area. Burn the area to a dark tan or light brown color. Don't worry if your color is not uniform, as the variations will add to the overall texture in the area. Lightly burn over the larger scales to give them a touch of color. Then start on the blue skin and the blue portion of the scales to the left of the eye. I'm going to warn you now that I bounced around a bit while working on the lizard, especially around the eye area. This is another area I recommend using a small shader or writer pen tip, as there are a number of small scales to burn around. Next, burn a dark line under the second lower eyelid. After that, finish burning in the blue skin and the dark shadows to the right of the eye. Don't worry about replicating the reference photo exactly. The reference photo is just a guideline. No one is going to look at your artwork and compare each and every scale. Instead, they will see the eye and notice that there are a lot of scales, and they will be very impressed with your artwork. Lightly burn over the large reflection on the eye. Darken up the upper eyelid, but make sure the crest or the highest area on the eyelid is the palest in color. Our goal is to make the eyelid look like it's domed, so if the highest area is light and the sides are darker, that will give the eyelid a curving or domed appearance. I am mostly using circular motion for this, but I also use some uniform strokes. If needed, reburn over the blue skin to the right of the eye to darken it up. I am using Colwood's standard writer pen tip for this. What I like about this pen tip is you can alter the width of your burn stroke depending on how you hold the pen. If held so that both metal wires are parallel with the ground so that you can see them both, this will give you a wide burn stroke, which is great for quickly filling in small areas. If the pen is held so that the wires are parallel with the wall, you can only see one or the top wire. Now you get a very small or thin burn line, and this is perfect for fine detailing work. Lightly burn over this thin band of scales, then resume burning in the blue skin and shadows to the right of the eye. During the reburn, also burn in the shadows around some of the adjacent scales. Burn in the skin around the small scales by the lower eyelid. Make sure to consult with the reference photo often, as some of the shadows are much lighter in color than others. Really darken up the thin shadows under the eyelids. Green arrows are pointing to the spots. Afterwards, resume burning in the shadows and visible skin around the scales to the right of the eye. Continue to burn in the shadows under the eyelid. I am using circular motion as my burn stroke for this. Also burn in the shadows or skin around the small scales on the lower right eyelid. Next, define the area around some of the scales to the left of the eye. I guess technically I'm burning in blue markings on a few of the scales. Afterwards, if needed, darken up the first lower eyelid. This area should be dark, but make sure it remains several shades lighter in color than the dark eye. Like before, I'm using circular motion as I'm burning in the shadows and blue areas. The reason for using circular motion is that it tends to create subtle variations in the burn results. If you examine the scales closely, you'll see that they are not uniform in color, so circular motion mimics that. Plus, I like the subtle added texture it gives to the area. Switch to a shader pen tip and burn over the lower eyelids to darken them up. Make sure to add more color where the shadows are located. Looking at the reference photo, you can see that the left side is lighter in color than the right, but near the center is where the shadows are the darkest. If you look at the real-time video in the upper right corner, you'll see that I'm mostly using circular motion while I work on the eyelids. Let's talk about some basic information for creating scales. With this first circle, I'm burning it to a fairly uniform color. How I am doing this is not important, because the purpose of the demonstration is to show that an object filled with uniform color will look flat. This circle, I will make it look rounded by using contrast and gradient shading. For contrast, I will burn the edges of the circle dark and leave the center much lighter. Then I use gradient shading to transition between the edges and the center of the circle. Otherwise, it would look like a pale circle with a dark ring around it. As you can see, this circle looks very rounded or domed. Most lizard scales are not very rounded. Instead, they tend to look like thin, flat rocks sitting on the skin surface. Or maybe like somebody cut the top off of a dome to flatten it out. To create that look, the sides of the circle are darkened up, but the color should only be a few shades darker than the center. Using circular motion on the flattened top or center of the circle will give it subtle variation. The scale should not be uniform in color. With this scale, we're going to add a highlight. The little penciled-in X mark indicates where the light is coming from. This means that the side of the scale closest to the light is the palest in color. The opposite side of the scale is where the darkest shadows would be. So begin by burning around the edges of the scale. Then use circular motion to burn over the top of the scale. Make sure to leave a highlight near the edge closest to the light source. Again, the X is indicating the light source. Afterwards, darken up the edge opposite of the light source to put it in shadows. This scale is just like the last one, except I moved the light source. Again, the X marks the source of light, so the side closest to the light source is the palest. The darkest shadow is on the opposite edge from the light source. Burn around the edges of the scale. Use circular motion on the top of the scale. Leave a highlight near the edge closest to the light source, and darken up the edge on the opposite side of the scale. Now we're going to repeat the same process, but on non-round shapes. The first example shows that when you burn something to a uniform color, it looks flat. This scale will be very rounded or domed looking because of the increase in contrast between the edges and the highlight. The more extreme the contrast is on an object, the more rounded or domed it will look. But remember, you must use gradient shading to transition between the lights and dark, otherwise it will just look like rings of color. Now we will reduce the contrast between the lights and darks so that the shape looks flatter or less rounded in appearance. The same basic steps apply to this scale. Burn in the sides a couple of shades darker than the top, and use circular motion over the top to color it and give it a subtle texture or slight color variation. Now we'll repeat the same basic process that we did on the last scale, but this time we're adding a light source. The light source gives us a highlight or pale area on the top of the scale that is closest to the light source. The edge of the scale opposite of the light source will be the darkest area on the scale. With the last scale example, it is just like the previous scale we just did. The only difference is that the light source has been moved. Hopefully, I have demonstrated how easy it is to change the appearance of a scale by altering the contrast levels or moving the light source around. With the basic understanding of how to create scales, let's work on the scales along the right of the lower eyelid. Quite a few of the scales are in shadows, so the highlights aren't that bright. Regardless, start out by burning along the edges of a scale and then burn in the center of it. With flatter scales, use circular motion on the top to give it a little color variation and a slight texture. But don't get too extreme with the color variation. We want this to be subtle. Burn in each scale individually and consult with the reference photo before starting a new scale. Determine how dark to burn the scale and how pale the highlight should be on it. Also determine how rounded the scale is Some scales are very rounded and domed looking, but most of them are on the flatter side. Lightly burn over any of the last unburned areas on the lower eyelid. Also, lightly burn over the reflection on the eye. I didn't get that on videotape. Then burn in a couple of the more defined scales along the left edge of the eyelid. Again, burn each one individually, but consult with the reference photo before starting on one. Now we will start on the snout, or the scales along the upper portion of the jaw. If you look at the reference photo, you'll see that some of the scales have dark blue bumps or spots on them. I purposely ignored these because I figured they would end up looking like shadows instead of bumps. If you want to include the blue spots or bumps on your artwork, then please do so. The two scales circled in green are very rounded and have a highlight along the upper edge. The bottom edge curves inward and is very shadowed. As you burn in the scales, make sure to replicate those observations. I am predominantly using circular motion to burn in the scales. With this scale, I am using uniform strokes to give the scale a base layer of color. Afterwards, I burned over it using circular motion to give it shape and slight color variation. Obviously, there are different ways you can burn in the scales and still get the same results. So I recommend that you experiment around and see which way works best for you. The scales I'm working on are in a bit of a depression area, so they don't have bright highlights on them. Also, you will see that I'm reburning over numerous scales. As more of the surrounding area got burned in, I looked at some of those original scales and thought the shadows weren't dark enough, so I'm fixing that. A reminder that each scale needs to be burned in individually. Before you start working on a scale, always consult with the reference photo first. Determine the lightest and the darkest areas on the scale. Pay close attention to the shape of the scale. How rounded is it? Another thing to notice is the area between the scales. In some areas, there seemed to be a gap or deep shadows between scales. Other places have thin lines. Some of the lines can be very dark. As you burn in the scale, replicate what you see. Check frequently with the reference photo as you work to ensure you are burning the scale accurately. It doesn't need to be perfect. Anything in the ballpark will do. Another important thing is to make sure the scales on the snout are similar in color. It wouldn't look right to have a dark brown scale in the midst of light brown ones. Remember to rotate the board if needed while you work. You'll see that I am angling my hand and altering how I hold the pen tip as I burn in lines and shadows around the scales. I was trying my best to avoid rotating the board because it can be uncomfortable to watch on video, but there are times when it is necessary. I am using a combination of uniform strokes and circular motion to burn in the scales. This does not mean that you have to use the same burn strokes. I have also switched to a larger shader so that I can burn in the scales quicker. Finish burning in the first 2 rows of scales above the line marked with an orange arrow. Notice how the shadows aren't as dark around the scales the further from the eye you are. Also, the highlights are quite a bit brighter on these scales. Afterwards, do any fine-tuning of the scales if needed. Now we will work on the scales along the top of the snout. The first row of scales are transitions. They curve along the bottom and flatten out at the top. This means the highlight is formed where the scale bends. A green arrow is pointing to one of the highlights that I'm referring to. Whereas the scales on the top of the snout have the highlight along the left edge. A green arrow is pointing to one of the highlights. As you burn in the scales, be mindful of where the highlights are located. You may have noticed that I didn't make my highlights very bright or extremely pale in color. This was a personal choice I made, and you can decide for yourself how pale you want to make your highlights. The scales along the far back edge of the snout are slightly out of focus in the reference photo. It can be hard to tell individual scales apart along that area. Plus, they don't have much in the way of highlights. I chose to give them a little more definition, but in all honesty, I doubt anyone will really notice one way or the other. So do what you think looks best. As we near the eye ridges, notice how the closer one has scales that have clearly defined edges. You can also see the blue bumps on the scales. The scales on the far ridge aren't as defined. It is hard to tell the scales apart. In fact, to me, they look like a row of large V-shaped scales that have a highlight along the top or left edge, and the bottom is shadowed. Now, I did not do a good job of differentiating between the two ridges in my artwork. Instead, my artwork ended up looking like there was just one ridge. To fix that, I should have darkened up the back ridge more, as the contrast would have helped them look like two separate ridges. I am burning in the slightly out of focus scales along the back edge of the lizard. I am giving them a touch more definition than the reference photo shows, but not a lot more. Mostly I'm giving them color with some slight variation, and then I'm burning thin, barely noticeable lines around the scales. With the scales on the closer or in-focus ridge, I made sure each scale was clearly defined. Again, I made the choice to ignore the blue bumpy dots on the scales, but if you'd like to include them, then I recommend using a writer pen tip to burn them in. Use the front edge of a shader and tap it along the back of the upper eyelid to replicate the texture that is found there. I am using the razor edge of a small shader to burn in the visible blue skin on the upper eyelid, but a writer pen tip would probably be easier for this task. After burning in the skin, then burn over the scales so they are fairly uniform in color. As you finish burning in the scales on the upper eyelid and ridge, remember that each scale needs to be burned in individually. This will produce more realistic results. Now I do want to point out that the darker burn areas were created by reburning and by holding the pen tip in place for a second or two. I did not increase the heat setting on my burner. Along the left side of the eye, there are some dark blue scales with white markings on them. Don't worry about replicating them exactly. Instead, fill the area with a variety of color created by using circular motion. Then, tap over the scales with the end of the pen tip to give the area a little more color variation. Make sure to leave a couple of small areas very pale. As you finish up the scales on the ridge, be mindful of where the highlights are located. Most have highlights along their bottom edge, but the two larger scales at the base of the ridge have highlights along the bend. Finish burning in the scales around the eye and do any fine-tuning if needed. Keep in mind that while I am using the razor edge of the shader to burn in the lines between the scales, you can also use a writer pen tip for this. Then afterwards, switch back to a shader to burn over the scales. Next, we will work on the scales along the side of the face. These scales have clearly defined edges, and there is a lot of dark blue skin showing. Also, there is a concave or depression area that is to the left of the eye, and the scales in this area don't have very bright highlights on them. Like we have done with all of the scales, use circular motion to give them color with a subtle variation. Burn each scale individually. You can also give the scales a base layer of color using uniform strokes and then reburn over it with circular motion to give it that slight color variation. Always consult with the reference photo before starting a new scale to determine where the highlight is and the general shape of the scale. Some scales are more rounded or domed than others. I've mentioned before that the dark blue areas have been created by reburning and holding the pen tip in place for a very short amount of time. The heat setting on the burner does not have to be adjusted. That said, you can burn in all of the dark areas first and then burn in each scale individually afterwards. Either way will produce the same great results. I've mentioned before that I'm using circular motion as my main burn stroke for the scales. By changing my hand speed, I can alter the darkness of the burn stroke. A fast hand speed produces light-colored burn results, whereas a slower hand speed will produce darker-colored burns. Another way to change the color of the burn is by altering the burn stroke size. When I'm working around the edges of the scale, I often burn very small circles. This produces a darker burn that has less color variation in it. Over the surface or the top of the scale, I increase the size of the circles to get a lighter burn result and more color variation. Using both hand speed and burn stroke size allows you to create a very large range of tonal hues, and you can control how much color variation is in the burn result. As we finish up the scales located between the eye and the mouth line, notice the depression area that's found under the lower eyelid. The scales in this area are in shadows. Also, there is a white area along the edge of the mouth. On the pattern, this area is represented with a series of dots. Most of the scales touching this area fade to white along their bottom edge, and the lines between the scales fade out in the white area. The upper jaw sticks out over the lower jaw, so there is a cast shadow on the lower jaw. Plus, the edge of the upper jaw is rounded. It is not a crisp, hard line. Make sure to burn a thin, dark tan band of color along the edge of the upper jaw to give it that rounded appearance. Burn in the cast shadow on the lower jaw. The dark shadow will keep the white area looking white even after it gets burned to a tan color. Afterwards, resume burning in the scales on the upper jaw. To cut down on the length of this video, I quit showing myself burning in the lines between the scales. I also quit showing the times I'm reburning over scales. So that is why lines are appearing and some areas are suddenly getting darker. Notice how I am using a zigzag or back and forth burn stroke right over the line. This creates the shadowed sides for both scales that touch the line. It works pretty well, and it's something I started doing on the scales in this area. Finish up the last of the scales and then burn over the white area. The lower edge of the white area should be a dark tan color that fades by a shade or two once you reach the scales. Let's burn in the scales on the lower jaw and get the lizard finished up. The scales right next to the upper jaw are a bit dark and rough looking. The rest of the scales are just like the scales we've been burning in all along, so nothing new or different. As always, consult with the reference photo often when you work. When you are examining the reference photo, lift your pen tip up and away from the board. With the last portion of the jaw, there is a concave area along the lower left side. The scales in this area are in shadows and not clearly defined. This area looks like it is filled with 3 rows of long, narrow scales. The base of the scales are deeply shadowed. When you work on the scales in this area, make sure that they are several shades darker than the scales on the rest of the jaw. Also, don't give them a lot of detail. Once the scales are done, do any fine-tuning if needed. I am reburning over most of the concave area on the jaw to darken it up. Here's how the artwork ended up looking. I wasn't happy with the negative space above the lizard. To me, it was too distracting. It kept drawing my eye to the area. To fix that, I'm burning in the background. Here's the comparison of before and after the background was burned in. That's it. We are all done. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. On my website, Pyrography Made Easy, I have the written version of this tutorial along with a free pattern and the reference photo. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Well, thank you for watching my video, and I will see you next week.